We're here at the beautiful University of Tennessee Botanical Gardens for our next virtual field trip. About this garden. It was a visionary creation of a department head when there was an ornamental horticulture program named Doug Crater. And this used to be just a blank kind of grassy, weedy area. And the first beds of plants that came in were just regimented beds of plants. But he got permission to plant some. And ever since it's grown, it was taken over by Don Williams and then subsequently by Sue Hamilton. And most recently, the director now is James Newburn. And I think you'll see they have done a wonderful job of making a really aesthetic place to see plants, have plants in their in a beautiful setting. And we're going to take a look at some of these today on our virtual field trip. Oh, some more weeding we've done for the UT gardening program. This is a member of a family you recognize by the inflorescence. It's got a little bit more scattered kind of inflorescence than other things we've seen, but you'll notice that these are compound umbels. Here's an individual compound umbel with the individual little umbellets at the top, and the two-carpellate inferior ovary, little tiny kind of yellowish corolla, or excuse me, whitish corolla. And this is a genus called Cyclospermum. It's a wild celery relative. 20 years ago, it was not in the UT Gardens. It has come in, and the UT Field Botany class was actually one of the first groups to document its presence for Knox County. And it's become a very abundant weed now. Growing next to the tomatoes is a wonderful plant that you might use to flavor a dish with tomatoes in it. This is a dill plant, and you should recognize the family. Notice the compound umbels. And then these individual flowers will have yellow corollas on them when they open up. This is still relatively early in blooming. And then later on, this particular central compound umbel has the fruits, and you can see the inferior ovary with the stylopodium on the top. So Apiaceae. The leaves, if we go down the stem, are alternate. They are compound, and they have sheathing petioles. All of that adds up to Apiaceae. Two members of Apiaceae growing abundantly in this garden bed. This one I suspect is a weed, although perhaps somebody didn't harvest their carrots. Notice the compound umbels, and notice that it has this ring of fringed bracts, these divided bracts. That distinguishes the genus Daucus, which is the wild carrot. And growing right up with it, another set of compound umbels. In this case, the umbels don't have any bracts associated with them. And this is parsley, the genus Petrosolinum. So parsley and Daucus growing right next to each other in this garden bed. We can complete our trio here of Apiaceae of economic importance in this garden. This is fennel. Notice the small little yellowish flowers, and they are combined into these compound umbels. And fennel, like parsley, doesn't have any bracts at the base of the compound umbel, but it has these leaves that have very broad sheaths, a very broad kind of sheathing petiole, and then finely divided upper parts. And it has a little bit different appearance from the dill, and also if you'll crush some of this up and smell it, nice anisey kind of smell. It has quite a different odor than the dill. Here's another plant in a family you recognize, has opposite leaves, and these opposite leaves, if we break one off, you can see has milky sap. And then going up to the inflorescence, you can see the inflorescence, a lot of flowers attached to a single point. And then if we take and look closely at one of these flowers, what we'll see is there is the corolla, is the backward bending parts. Underneath of that is the calyx. and those upward pinkish kind of parts is the corona. And then in the center there's the gynostegium with the pollinia attached around the stigmatic areas. This is a milkweed. This is our common milkweed. It has the name Asclepias syriaca, kind of an interesting misnomer. This was back in the 1700s. Linnaeus got a shipment of plants and it had been mislabeled as being from the Middle East, and so he called it syriaca, but it actually came from North America, and it's a very common species in North America, and it's a plant that's a favorite food source for the monarch butterfly. Common milkweed, Asclepias syriaca, and the family here is Apocynaceae. So if this shows up on your exam next Wednesday, you'd look at these characteristics and be able to diagnose Apocynaceae. This area was originally planted as a fuel plants garden, which accounts for the scenery here. But now we have in buckets a couple of interesting plants here. This one is an Araceae, and it's got the kind of typical aroid kind of pattern of these arrowhead-shaped leaves, the reticulate venation of the leaves. When this flowers, it'll have a spathe and a spadix. And remember that you don't take a bite out of these. They're filled with these calcium oxalate crystals. The Asteraceae is really the star of any flower garden, and so knowing that family, you'll probably be able to identify a good proportion of plants, at least a family, when you go into a flower garden. And here we have the genus Stokesea, named for a person named Stokes, and this actually has all disc flowers, but the outer series of disc flowers have very expanded corollas. And if you look at the developing flowers, you can see the involucre kind of coming up around them. These disc flowers have the obvious forked styles emerging from them. So Asteraceae, Stokesea. Here's another Asteraceae. This one again has doubled flowers, so many of the disc flowers are converted into ray flowers. This used to be called a chrysanthemum, and it really drives florists to distraction because botanists have reclassified this as dendranthemum, and of course they refuse to go along, and it's still chrysanthemum. If you buy this in your flower shop, you can see the heads here. We'll take a look at an individual one of these, and it has the involucre of bracts, and it has the small flowers, in this case mostly ray flowers, in the center. Isn't this a great color for the UT Gardens? This wonderful yellow-orange. And this is a plant that's a little deceptive when you see it in the flower garden because it looks like it's got a lot of petals. But it turns out it's an Asteraceae. Many people seeing this one from a distance would be tempted to call it some sort of an Apiaceae, but this is another version of yarrow, the genus Achillea, and this one has colored ray flowers, very prettily colored reddish ray flowers, and then yellow disc flowers to give it a really pretty appearance. If we look down at the stems, we can see the very highly dissected leaves that are characteristic of yarrow. And if we pull this apart a little bit, we can see the individually small heads, each with their own involucre of bracts, the little tiny red ray flowers, and then the yellow disc flowers. So another Asteraceae. This one is obviously a favorite with the bee crowd. Notice how these bumblebees are just harvesting away, getting the nectar and to a certain extent the pollen. It looks like the lack of pollen on their hind legs is they're really going for the nectar at this time of day. Probably earlier in the day it released its pollen. This is another Asteraceae, and if we take a look at this, it almost looks like a regular flower with petals, but if we turn this over we can see this involucre, and this is the type we saw in the Coreopsis. This is a related genus Cosmos, where we have two distinct kinds of involucral bracts. In this case the outer ring is bright green, the inner ring is kind of that subtle reddish orange color. So this is Cosmos in the Asteraceae. As these go into fruit, the fruits get these expanded apexes on them, and they'll have little hooks which will attach to animal fur or to people's clothing that help disperse these. Okay, you should recognize the family on this one. Look at these separate petals in the shape of a cross, making the corolla. We can pull these off. You can see this is another plant that has clawed petals, but it's not Caryophyllaceae, because inside of here we have 6 stamens, and they are tetradynamous, 2 short and 4 long. See the 6 tetradynamous stamens, 4 long and 2 short, and then this compound pistil, that superior ovary, will develop into a long, thin fruit that's characteristic of this family, and this is the family Brassicaceae. And this is actually radish, and we can zoom over to the base of the plant and see this is a radish that didn't get picked, and it's gone ahead and really developed into a massive radish. Here we have another kind of weedy plant, but this is an attractive weed, and the garden is actually purposely cultivating this one here. If we look down the stem, we can see it has opposite leaves from swollen nodes. The nodes kind of swell up a little bit. They don't have any stipules. It's the swelling in the on the nodes that's the evidence that there was stipules in the ancestor. And then if we look at one of these individual flowers, beautiful pink petals, and when we pull these apart, the petals come off individually, and they have the beautiful clawed structure that we talked about earlier in the semester of having a basal claw and a terminal limb, very characteristic of this family. 5 of those. It has 10 stamens, and then as we pull this apart we will see in the center there's a single pistil with a superior ovary, and that ovary is compound. The ovary is compound, and it will take X-ray vision at this point to tell you that this has free central placentation. We could take and dissect this in front of the microscope and confirm that. So this is the family Caryophyllaceae. Actually, when you hear that term free central placentation, it gives you a big hint that this is going to be Caryophyllaceae. This is an interesting plant called soapwort. The scientific name is Saponaria officinalis. The officinalis part tells you it was sold in stores in medieval times, and the saponaria part comes from the presence of saponins, which form suds. They are a type of chemical that if you take parts of this plant and you crush them up in water, you get suds that were once used for washing things like clothes. An alternative name for the plant is bouncing bet, and bouncing bet is the Old English term for a washerwoman. So this plant was associated with washing things. On this continent, it's somewhat of a weed, and you'll find it mostly in places like railroad tracks and roadsides, but here it's planted in the garden. Here's another wetland plant, kind of these miscellaneous brownish, greenish looking inflorescences. This one though has decidedly triangular stems. If I try to rotate it, it goes bump, bump, bump. If we go down and look at the leaves, you can see that the leaves start with a sheath and the edges of the sheath are fused. So sedges have edges. This is the Cyperaceae. Looking at these reproductive structures, we can see there is a terminal set of reproductive structures that were the staminate flowers. They look pretty anemic here. And then these big robust sets of pistillate flowers, each has a little sac around it. So this is the genus Carex, and these individual sacs are called perigynia. So this particular Carex is Carex crinita. Here's another Carex. This is just broadening your appreciation of Carex. Huge amounts of differences in the size of these perigynia. This is fox sedge, and these perigynia are little teeny tiny perigynia, and they're in tiny clusters, much smaller, much raggeder looking than the Carex crinita that we just looked at. This is Carex vulpinoidea, but it has the typical Cyperaceae, triangular stems, sedges have edges, and the leaves are three-ranked with the sheath fused around the stem. A common aspect of gardens is they have weeds, and it's a continual challenge for the gardener. So we're going to help out the UT crew here and pull one of these weeds out. We won't charge them for our services. And then we'll take a close look at this. And what you will see is that when we break off a piece of this, it has milky sap. That's a first clue. And then when we look at the individual, what look like flowers, we'll notice with our hand lens that actually these white things are petaloid appendages of the bracts. And notice the big fat green pistils that are flopping out. Those are actually pistillate flowers. And the staminate flowers are tucked down. This whole thing that is containing these is called a cyathium. That's a term you should remember. And this is a member of the Euphorbiaceae. And this is Euphorbia nutans, which is a little common weed that we find in weedy areas all across campus, including the botanical gardens. Here's another Euphorbiaceae. This one was planted deliberately. This is castor bean or ricinus, and it has different staminate or male flowers, the whitish structures here, which are composed mainly of just the stamens. And then it has the pistillate flowers, and the pistillate flowers have a big gynoecium, and that ovary is going to expand, and we'll see that expanding further on to develop into a capsule. So this is castor bean, Ricinus communis, in the Euphorbiaceae. We'll do another little bit of weeding for our UT Garden friends. This little plant is called a sand mat. You can see it just flops down here on the ground. There's actually just one plant here, and if we pull it out, you can see this is the one that we identified in class, member of the Euphorbiaceae. Has milky sap coming out when you break the stems or the leaves. It has these little tiny cyathea, in this case with a little bit of with the ovary flopping out and just little tiny glands surrounding it. So Euphorbia maculata, notice the spots on the leaves, and the common name is sand mat. We're a little short on Fabaceae today, and we're going to have to look at some atypical ones. You probably would not get one like this to be asked on the exam, but you would possibly get one that has these alternate compound leaves, in this case bipinnately compound, with stipules at the base. And then these flowers form little powder puffs in these terminal capitate inflorescences. And each flower has numerous stamens, a little tiny actinomorphic corolla at the base, and a single pistil, which characterizes Fabaceae. So this is a mimosa. This is one of our wild mimosas, not native to Tennessee, but planted here in the garden. And we can see here an example of the legumes as they start to develop from that capitate inflorescence. Fabaceae. Here's another somewhat atypical Fabaceae compared to what we've seen. Still typical in terms of the compound leaves with stipules alternate. When we look at the flowers, however, they're not quite the full Papilionaceae syndrome. They have the zygomorphic corolla, but the petals are not fused to make a keel. And then they have separate stamens and a single pistil, which is characteristic of Fabaceae. This is what's called the sessilpinoid type of flower. And this is Senna marilandica. And Senna marilandica goes by the name of wild senna. So the genus name is used for the common name. The water tanks here in the entrance area host some aquatic plants, and a couple of these we're going to look at. This particular one illustrates the family, and then it illustrates what horticulturalists sometimes do with our plants. You can see this is an aquatic plant, and as I roll this stem here, the stem is round in cross section, and looking in at the individual flowers, each flower has 6 brownish tepals and then a 3-carpellate superior ovary in the center. So this is a rush, member of Juncaceae. This is actually one of the same species we saw, Juncus effusus, only horticulturalists have selected for a really odd growth form where the stem spirals and makes these interesting twists, which makes it visually interesting. We would not find this normally in nature, but this is one that's been propagated, and you'll find this planted in people's horticultural gardens. The UTGardens had a problem. They have this wet area that goes down through it. There was a continual problem. And so they did the logical thing. You got lemons, you make lemonade. So they took this kind of wet area and they made it into an actual wetland. And we can see some characteristic wetland plants here. And that gives us an opportunity to compare grass-like plants. And the grass-like plants are called graminoids. And the first one we're going to look at today is this one that has the round stems, that if I twist this around in my fingers, it goes round and round smoothly. Notice that it looks like the stem goes past where all of the flowers are, and this is a bract that terminates the stem, and then the individual flowers have little tiny tepals, 6 in number in each of these flowers. So this is a rush. This is a member of the Juncaceae. The name rush is used for both Cyperaceae and Juncaceae plants, so it's better just to say that this is a Juncus in the This one is a favorite with the honeybee crowd, and there are honeybees and other pollinators swarming on this. This has these dense terminal spikes of flowers. Notice the bilabiate corollas, and my x-ray eyes tell me that the ovary is deeply four-lobed. If we pull back the plant and look at the stem, we can see the opposite leaves and the stem with angles so that it's square in cross-section. So this is another member of Lamiaceae. This is Anise hyssop, and it's a great garden plant because it will keep producing flower spikes throughout the summertime. And all you have to do is put a couple of plants of this in the back of your garden, and you'll have a continuous show from about June until October. The kitchen garden, not surprisingly, is dominated by members of the mint family because they have such wonderful flavors in their vegetative parts. This one you can see is a Lamiaceae, the bilabiate corollas, the 4 epipetalous stamens protruding out here, the square stems and opposite leaves. This is a member of the basal genus Ocimum. And as a gardener, normally you would want to pinch off these flowers before they started blooming to encourage your plant to make more leaves, and then you can take those leaves and mash them up and make a nice pesto. Here's a nice example of our state tree growing here near the entrance area. But this plant has also been messed with by horticulturalists. It's one that produces different sectors with different colors of green. We call such a leaf a variegated leaf. And so this is Liriodendron tulipifera. Just as a reminder, this family that it belongs to has these alternate leaves, and the leaves had a stipule that was attached at the base, and that remnant of that is this circular scar around the twig where that stipule was located. And we looked at the flowers with their several simple tepals, their numerous stamens, numerous simple pistils earlier. This is Magnoliaceae, Liriodendron tulipifera. And here at the apex, you can see very nicely the stipules before they have fallen off. And they look like little ears coming up at the base of this particular leaf. So this is a pair of stipules. These will fall off early on their own and leave behind a scar. If everything was this big, botany would be easy. We have this plant that has these 5 separate petals. It has this column of stamens surrounding the styles, and notice these are the stigmas, these little pink kind of ball-like things at the end of these structures here. These are the stigmas at the end of the style, and you have numerous stamens. If you look here, you can see a drunken honeybee sipping in the nectar here, looking pretty happy. Maybe that nectar's fermented a little bit. This is the family Malvaceae. We expect to see when we look at the other side that we have an epicalyx underneath the calyx of fused sepals. And then we'll look down at a vegetative portion of the plant, and we can see it has these alternate leaves with the major venation is palmate. So there are several major veins that branch out from the base of the blade, and then there are succeeding blades up here. So this major venation is palmate, and that is characteristic of Malvaceae. This plant, the stipules are kind of inconspicuous, but it also has the stipules that have probably fallen off actually. And in bud, you can see pretty clearly the epicalyx surrounding the green sepals that are folded up over the rest of the flower. So this is Malvaceae. Very easy one to diagnose from these really huge flowers. This is the genus Hibiscus. And there must be a research project here at UT that's looking at hibiscus, because we're in a sea of plants, but this is the only one that started blooming. Another wet area plant, but grasses can also occur in wet areas. This plant has round stems, round in cross section, and if we look at the leaves, we can see that the leaves have a sheath that is separate. And so we can peel back that sheath, and we have the blade joining the sheath, and there's a little ligule there. We can go to the reproductive parts here of this grass, and we can see that we have a series of perfectly good spikelets in a terminal spike here. And each spikelet has 2 glooms at the base. Perhaps we can go to this bottom one and see this. There's gloom 1, gloom 2, and then it has a pair of little spikelets. Each floret has a palea and a lemma. And we need to go to the microscope to pull these apart and really see these, or have a hand lens in the field. This is a member of the genus Elymus, and this is called Elymus hystrix, and the common name is bottlebrush grass, and you can appreciate that common name by the appearance of this spike of spikelets. So grasses have round stems in cross-section, open sheaths. They have a pair of sterile bracts at the base of the spikelet, and then each flower is surrounded by 2 bracts, the palea and lemma. Here's another family that you will recognize, although horticulturalists have messed with the corolla on this one. This one has alternate compound leaves, that lack any kind of stipules. And then if you zoom in on the flower, you can see the numerous stamens and the simple pistils. And what the horticulturalists have done is to, again, double the flowers and produce this multitude of petals on these flowers. This is the genus Delphinium, the larkspurs, and this family is the Ranunculaceae. So Ranunculaceae, separate petals, no hypanthium, numerous stamens, numerous simple pistils, alternate. Here's the first plant we identified in class. Seems like ages ago. Hard to believe it was only a few weeks. This, of course, is Ranunculus sardis. In the Ranunculaceae, notice the distinguishing features of the family: the alternate leaves, no stipules, the five sepals that are separate, the numerous stamens and numerous pistils, the lack of a hypanthium. The lack of hypanthium and the lack of stipules separates it from Rosaceae. So this is Ranunculaceae, Ranunculus sardis, hairy buttercup. This whole garden here features one genus of plants, the genus Rosa, and of course this is Rosaceae. Many of these have doubled flowers. In the case of these flowers, it's stamens that have been converted into petals rather than disc flowers into ray flowers. In this particular cultivar, you can still see an abundant number of stamens surrounding those styles that are coming out from the center, but you can see quite a few of them have been converted into petals. So this is the genus Rosa. If we look at the leaves, we can see they're alternate compound leaves with stipules. Rosaceae. Here we have another member of Rosaceae. You can see the compound leaves with stipules. And then this has been done flowering for a while. And what you see is the developing fruit, which is an aggregate fruit. And it's an aggregate of numerous drupelets. So this is a raspberry in the genus Rubus. And this is the family Rosaceae. We would eat some for you, but there's a big sign here that asks us not to. Here's still another Rosaceae in fruit, and this one had an inferior ovary surrounded by the hypanthium, and it's the hypanthium that actually develops into the fleshy part of this reproductive structure. The fruit is a kind of berry called a pome, and this is an apple, the genus Malus, in the Rosaceae. You can see alternate leaves with stipules completes the Rosaceae feature. This is one way to grow apples. This is called espalier, where they are pruned to go along a fence, which makes them low growing and easy to harvest. Okay, here's a plant that has 5 Maris corollas, and if we manipulate them a little bit, you can see that they come off as a single piece. So 5 united petals in the corolla, 5 epipetalous stamens, and then left behind is an inferior ovary. If we go down and look at the vegetative part of the plant, you can see there are leaves that are opposite, and they have stipules. And so inferior ovaries, stipules, opposite leaves, 5-membered corollas. This is Rubiaceae, and this is the genus Pentas, which is a popular bedding plant in gardens. I've waded into the wetland here and looking at the shrub. This was out at the Melton Hill field trip. It wasn't yet in bloom. I'm going to take a piece of this and walk out here so that you can take a look at the close details of these flowers. Notice this plant was a shrub, and it often has whorled leaves. I managed to get a branch that just has opposite leaves with stipules, but some branches will have whorled leaves. And then the flowers form these little spheres, and each individual flower has a 5 Maris corolla, 5 epipetalous stamens, and a single pistil, which is 2 carpellate with an inferior ovary. And if we look at this one that's finished blooming, we can scrape off these corollas, and you can see the calyx here sitting on top of the inferior ovary. They're teeny tiny, and you really need a microscope to see this. So inferior ovary, 5 mirrors, corolla, epipetalous stamens, opposite leaves with stipules. This adds up to Rubiaceae. And this is a plant called buttonbush. Cephalanthus occidentalis is the scientific name, and it's a characteristic shrub of wetland areas. Very nice looking spheres of flowers when it's blooming. Look like little buttons. These beds at the very entrance focus on a couple of plants that we have talked about the families. This little white and pink colored plant is a petunia, and you should recognize the family from its characteristics. It's got alternate leaves, no stipules. The calyx is 5 mirrors, 5 united sepals. The corolla has 5 united petals. And if we take and pull that apart, you'll see inside of there are 5 stamens poking out, and the stamens are attached to the corolla. And so if we detach the corolla, we get the stamens coming along with it. Then there is a single pistil with a superior ovary, and my x-ray eyes tell me it's 2 carpellate. So this is the family Solanaceae, and this is the genus Petunia. This corner of the garden has several plants that you'll recognize the families. This one, of course, you'll recognize probably the plant. This is a tomato. And if we look at the tomato flower, we can see that it has 5 united petals. It has 5 epipetalous stamens, and they form kind of a cylinder through which that style emerges. And the fruit we've already looked at is a 2-carpellate fruit with axil placentation. So this is the genus Solanum in the Solanaceae. Here's another family you'll recognize, actually a repeat of one of the earlier ones. Notice the 5 mirrors corollas, the 5 epipetalous stamens poking out the top, the alternate leaves. This is eggplant, and this is the member of the Solanaceae, another member of this huge genus Solanum. Another plant of this large family with economic importance. This one is the genus Capsicum. A little unusual for the family that it has 6 rather than 5 corolla lobes, 6 epipetalous stamens, superior pistil with a 2-carpellate ovary. This is the Solanaceae. And this, of course, is our pepper, which is misnamed because Columbus made the voyage to get black pepper, and he was a good salesman, and he came back with a spicy plant, and he told the Spanish monarchy, this is pepper. And so now we have to distinguish between chili peppers, which have the hot flavoring from the alkaloid capsaicin, from the black peppers of the Far East, which have a quite different type of flavoring.